All right, welcome back. This is presentation 2 of Chapter 14, Domestic Policy. We have been talking just about this idea that this aspect of the course is focusing on bringing all these strands of things together, how parties, interest groups, the constitutional principles, everything kind of gets mushed in, and this is the output of American federal government. So let's jump in. We've been talking about kind of domestic policy broadly. We're focusing on in this presentation on economic policy. So in terms of tax brackets, America's tax system is progressive, which is again designed. The burdens are designed to fall more heavily on high-income earners because they can generally better afford higher rates of taxation. That means again, annual income is broken down into brackets. By the amount of income, 40 to 50,000, 50 to 60,000, and so on. In 2020, no American paid tax on the first $12,000 of their income, while the next $9,875 is taxed at 10%. The next $30,250 is taxed at 12%, and again, going forward. Social Security is also a dedicated tax. And that is, again, basically the idea that taxation falls more heavily, regressive taxes fall more heavily on lower income groups. With Social Security, regressivity is created by a cap on income that is subject to this dedicated tax that comes directly out of your pay. So that goes directly into the Social Security trust fund. Part of the reason that Social Security remains a regressive tax are sort of the redistributive implications of the program. Social Security was designed to provide greater levels of help to lower income Americans than middle or upper class Americans, because lower income Americans are more likely to find themselves in that tragic position of elderly poverty. In 2020, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, FICA, which is the dedicated fund for Social Security, applied to the first $137,700 of income. No one's income is taxed above that level. So Mike Gundy, who has been OSU's football coach for going on 19 years, earns $7.5 million annually, which means that $7.36 million of his income is not subject to Social Security taxation. So that gives you an idea of how that how the wealthy are really not that badly impacted by Social Security. Spending and budgeting, the power to authorize and appropriate money. These are the authorities that are really most importantly granted to Congress by the Constitution. An example of what passes for congressional humor is that authorizers think they're gods, appropriators know they're gods. I always like that joke. The federal government has the constitutional authority to run annual budget deficits, which again, that means in contrast to state governments, most state and local governments have balanced budget requirements, but the federal government can actually spend beyond the revenues it actually brings in, so they don't have to go through an equalization process to ensure that they have the money to meet their obligations. They can simply, run deficits. The national debt is the sum of all prior annual deficit budgets. It's around $30 trillion right now. That sounds like a lot, but we're producing upwards of $18 trillion a year in annual income. So again, the federal government, and again, with any deficit, it is, it's what you pay for. You get what you pay for in terms of debt. If you're going into debt, going on shopping sprees, that's one thing. If you're going into debt, buying a home or doing something that is going to, provide durable value for you down the line, it's a different matter altogether. The federal government used deficit spending to combat the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, as well as the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 and 2021. And we'll discuss the mechanics of those policy responses in a bit. Federal government uses subsidies and contracts to encourage certain kinds of business activities. Subsidies are government grants of cash and other valuable commodities such as land to an individual or an organization that's used to promote activities desired by the government, to reward political support, or to buy off political opposition. Contracting refers to the power of the government to set conditions on companies seeking to sell goods or services to government agencies, and that happens quite a bit. Contracting can be deployed to encourage corporations to improve themselves through workplace safety rules, to build up whole sectors of the economy, to promote certain desirable goals and behavior. An older example of the federal government's use of contracting power to advance policy goals was the extension of the federal government's contracting authority to the just then building airline industry to carry mail by air. The clearest example of a contemporary use of federal contracting authority is the Biden administration's executive order mandating that all companies holding federal contracts need to be able to document their employees are vaccinated or submit to weekly testing. I'm sure that for many of you think that's very controversial, and several state attorneys generals have sued the federal government to stop the Biden administration. However, the testing mandate is clearly well within the federal government's public health responsibilities, and similar actions in the past have been held to be constitutional. The OMB plays an important role, as does the CBO. The executive and legislative branches of government both recognize the importance of the budgeting process for controlling the nature and scope of the federal government activities over the economy. The Office of Management and Budget is responsible for preparing the budgets, the federal government, the president's budget, and establishing the president's spending priorities. Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act in 1921 to reflect the growing influence of the presidency over key aspects of the federal bureaucracy. The Congressional Budget Office was created in 1974, and it was designed to provide provide Congress with expert advice on the implications of budgeting, of legislation, of the budgetary implications of legislation. So the CBO's mission is to provide independent, objective economic analysis of the costs of proposed legislation. So again, congressional intent in creating the CBO was to consolidate Congress's role in the budgetary process and to ensure Congress access to accurate and reliable information about the costs and economic impact of specific legislative proposals. And again, sometimes the CBO says things that Congress doesn't like to hear. Monetary policy that refers to government efforts to regulate the economy through the manipulation of the supply of money and credit. The Federal Reserve Board, which is also known as the Fed, is responsible for playing that role of central banking institution for the United States. So in macroeconomics, central banking institutions are independent or semi-independent banking institutions who enjoy monopoly control over a variety of central functions within the economy, including the management of monetary policy and ensuring a balance between maintaining price stability and high prices and high rates of employment. So importantly, the independence of the central banking institutions are guaranteed by law. In particular, that's really important because in theory it precludes the president from attempting to manipulate the value of currency in order to ensure a short-term advantage for the president and the president's party in election years. The history of the role of banks in American capitalism has been punctuated by intense political controversy, and again, there was actually a Bank of America in the early 19th century that was abolished during the Jackson administration. Currently, the current system was actually established in 1913, and it established 12 regional banks. The 7 regional reserve banks are independent of the political process, and neither the president nor Congress can directly intervene in their policies. So banks who join the Federal Reserve System can borrow from the regional Federal Reserve banks. The principal advantage is that banks can expand their loan operations continuously so long as there is sufficient demand. That advantage comes with rather significant strings attached. The Fed can giveth, the Fed can also taketh away. So the Fed can impose strict reserve requirements on banks seeking loans within the system, and the Fed can raise or lower the discount rate reserve banks extend to investment and commercial banks. Opening and closing what is known as the discount window gives the Fed powerful indirect control over the money supply in the economy. Again, by constricting the money supply, they can slow down the economy and prevent an inflationary cycle from tripping the economy into recession. Regulation and antitrust policy. There are 2 ways the federal economic regulatory regime is designed to protect consumers from potential abuses by concentrated economic power. First, the federal government establishes rules for the operation of big businesses to ensure fair competition. For example, federal regulators can require that information about corporations' activities and account books are publicly available. Second, federal regulators have access to antitrust laws that can determine whether a corporation is engaging in restraint on trade by driving competition out of business. Among the penalties available to federal regulators for corporate bad actors include breaking up large companies into smaller units. That's what happened with AT&T back in the days, where they just broke it up into constituent parts. Federal regulators can also engage in social regulation, which establishes conditions on businesses to protect workers, the environment, and consumers. The origins of the regulatory policy, again, calls for protective regulation began in the late 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. The Interstate Commerce Act was the first independent regulatory commission that was put in place to control the monopolistic practices of the railroads. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 covered all antitrust regulation. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, was abolished in 1995, but its functions continued under the Federal Trade Commission. And of course, the ball got launched by muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair, whose publication of The Jungle exposed really harsh working conditions and unsafe workplace practices in the meat packing industry in the early 20th century. The Food and Drug Administration was created in the 1930s and was authorized again to test and regulate various products considered essential to public health. Modern era of national regulation, again, it began in the 1930s as part of the New Deal, covering various economic sectors like securities, radio, banking, coal mining, and agricultural industries. So to illustrate, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created in the aftermath of the 1929 stock market crash. The SEC requires companies buying and selling stocks to disclose information about products they're trading, inform buyers of investment risks, and protecting investors against fraud. During the 1930s and 40s, Congress established the basic framework for American labor regulation, and that included, again, labor rules for collective bargaining, establishing a minimum wage. In the 1970s, agencies like the Consumer Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration were granted additional authority and expanded scope to protect and expand workplace safety. The trend since the 1970s has been towards deregulation, which is a largely conservative policy preference of reducing or eliminating regulatory restraints on the conduct of individuals or private institutions. The Reagan and Trump administrations were most notable for reducing the total number of regulations in the Federal Register, with the Trump administration imposing an executive order in 2017 requiring that 2 significant regulations must be eliminated for every one regulation added. So much of the government regulation is needed, and it's one of the main, how much regulation is needed is one of the main points of partisan disagreement between Democrats and Republicans. Economic policymaking is inherently political. American voters have a long history of punishing presidents when the economy is struggling. Until 1929, most Americans strongly adhered to assumptions guiding laissez-faire capitalism. However, the consequences of the Great Depression destroyed that consensus and led to thoroughgoing changes in the relationship between the economy and the state. In 1932, as we learned in earlier chapters, like the chapter 3 on federalism, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the forgotten man, and for much of the remainder of the 20th century, Keynesian economics prevailed. And Keynesian economics is this idea that government can stimulate the economy and act as the spender of last resort to keep the economy moving when otherwise people lack the resources to kind of do what they would ordinarily do in terms of buying and selling and earning income. There are lots of partisan divisions over the role of government in the economy. In the late 1970s, backlash against Democratic commitment to tax and spend policies fueled the rise of Republican supply-side economic policies, which basically is predicated on the idea that cutting taxes stimulates the economy. People at the upper end of the economy then use money to invest and to continue stimulating the economy, and that tax cuts will actually provide expansion. Ronald Reagan personified the Republican rejection of Keynesian economics in his first inaugural address with the statement, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is a problem." Republicans have steadily moved in a more laissez-faire direction over the past 40 years over taxes, government spending, and economic regulation. These debates intensified over the course of 2020 as the coronavirus pandemic led to calls for dramatic increases in government spending, resulting in the passage of the CARES Act, which was passed in March of 2020 and was largely bipartisan and included $1,200 payments to all American taxpayers, forgivable loans to small business owners who retained employees, $500 billion in loans to large corporations, and $338 billion in loans to state and local government. These actions were undertaken as the pandemic led to a significant shutdown of portions of the American economy and resulted in widespread unemployment in many economic sectors, particularly the restaurant, travel, and hotel industries. Following the 2020 presidential election, Republicans opposed any further attempts to expand the governmental response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular opposing mask and vaccine mandates. So on taxing and spending, if you think about it, Republicans embrace reducing the role of government, and that leads to calls for tax cuts as their highest priority, and that tends to be the one thing that they can all agree on as it relates to taxes. Since the Reagan administration, Republicans have embraced supply-side economics, which again, as I mentioned, is an economic theory claiming that reducing marginal tax rates will dramatically increase economic productivity by incentivizing greater levels of work and investment that would otherwise be discouraged in a higher tax regime. On spending, the two parties have long struggled to control government spending. Most Americans are easily persuaded by the theory that big government spending is wasteful, but polls reveal little support for cuts to specific programs, especially when people benefit, things like Social Security. Neither party is prepared to sacrifice the political capital necessary to cut major programs. So generally, Democrats prefer to enhance investment in major social welfare and economic programs and are reluctant to cut defense spending, while Republicans would prefer to spend more on the military and to cut major entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security. Economic regulation. The mission of federal regulation of business is to promote economic stability, maintain workplace safety, set minimum wages, and define overtime work ensure consumer satisfaction, and protect the environment. All of these things are, again, the point being, if the economy is growing but only benefiting a small sector of of Americans, that's not good for the economy overall. Businesses and corporations often use their economic influence to limit the government's role, while other interests press for stronger government regulations. Both parties point to public opinion surveys for support for their respective positions. The issue of the minimum wage is one that sharply divides both parties. Democrats advocate pegging the minimum wage to inflation, while many Republicans are opposed to a federal minimum wage at any level. As of November 2020, 30 states and nearly 4 dozen cities and counties had enacted minimum wage laws higher than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. So that's it for this slide. I've run a little bit long. Economic policy is a big area. So when we come back, we will continue other aspects of domestic policy. I'll see you next time.